What's up, guys? So today we are talking about what every character does best in Marvel Future Revolution. So let's get into it. Alright, so today we are going to be talking about what every character does best in Marvel Future Revolution. And what you see behind me on the screen is an infographic I made that I've called the Character Selection Guide. That's going to have the super short version of all the information we're going to go over in this video. But for people who wanted a slightly more detailed explanation, I wanted to make sure I cover it in a video as well. So in no particular order, let's start with Spider-Man. Alright, so looking at Spider-Man, like every character in this game, there are a few different build options available to him. So we'll start by looking at his primary stats. So as far as his attack, his defense, and his HP, Spider-Man actually has his primary stat as HP. He has a lot of health, but not far behind that, he also has well above average attack. The lowest of his three primary stats is defense. That's a little bit misleading because he makes up for that with a lot of natural dodge. So his highest natural stats are HP followed by dodge rate. And then his next highest stats, primarily debuff resistance. So there's a few different builds for Spider-Man. So in no particular order, he works very, very well as a fighter and a bruiser style character. So, using that high health to get into melee range and kind of throw down some natural dodge to make him kind of tanky, some above average attack, and he's just pretty well rounded. Another build you can go for with Spider-Man is dodge tank. You can really, really lean into that dodge. And you can really lean into that high health, and you can hold aggro for raid bosses and really not take a lot of damage. It's very impressive. And right now, the way accuracy is being calculated, we're getting interesting results. But dodge tank Spider-Man seems to be very strong right now. The third build option for Spider-Man, you can really lean into all of his hard CC. He does a good amount of stunning, knockdowns, things like that. So he's definitely more of a controller type. If you want to play him that way, you can really, really go in on the debuff accuracy and just control your opponents and not really let them move. And that's Spider-Man. All right, next up, looking at Iron Man, and we'll start off with his three primary stats. For him, they happen to go in order. He has really, really high attack, followed by really high defense, and finally, he's got decent health, but it's the weakest of his three primary stats, which kind of makes sense. He's got an iron suit around him for good defense, and he's known for just all sorts of weaponry and gadgets, so it lines up. So his highest natural stats, he actually leads the way in accuracy rate and critical rate, interestingly, making him among the best natural counters to characters like Spider-Man with a lot of dodge. And then where he comes in second place ranking for his stats across all the characters, defense, critical damage, and critical damage decrease, which all kind of makes sense. So as for his playstyle options, he's got a few different builds that are all somewhat similar. The first is you can build him as an outright burst mage or a blaster, where he can essentially fire off a lot of really hard hitting cooldowns really, really quick to put out a ton of damage, and then just kind of get out for a little bit and let his cooldowns come back, and his really high natural defense allows him to dip in and fire those off. Alternatively, he's got more of a raid DPS or a sustained DPS build, where he can put out a lot of damage consistently by leaning a bit more into the cooldown decrease and kind of alternate that with some of his bigger abilities, just lay down consistent heavy fire on bosses from afar. And finally, he has a spell slinger or a spam spellcaster build, where if you want to just go all in on the cooldown decrease and a lot of his specializations that essentially feed him back a lot of his cooldowns, you can have him really rapid fire, just firing off spells and doing a ton of damage. Some of the cooldowns that you would use to be able to fire them off a lot aren't as heavy hitting, but you can just keep a barrage of things flying your enemy's way. So he is a pretty standard traditional blaster mage type of character who can be played either for burst or for sustain, but really he brings the damage. Next up, we're looking at Captain America, and what should come as a surprise to absolutely no one. Captain America is a pretty standard tank archetype. As far as his base stats, he is number one across all characters for defense. His next best of the primary stats for him is HP, and finally attack. So he's very defense focused, no surprise. As far as his outright highest natural stats, he, of all the characters, has the highest defense, HP recovery, debuff resistance, and guard damage decrease. Pretty much all the tools that you're looking for as a primary tank. So He does have two really good tank builds, and they're a little bit distinct. The first is he can build as a tank who really leans into health steal and regeneration. He has some specializations that allow him to literally steal a percentage of the damage that he's doing to his enemies as health, and he can really lean into HP recovery and just get constant recharge of health and let his pretty much base level defenses do a lot of the work for buying him enough time to just constantly get that health back. Alternatively, he has another tank build that really leans into the damage reduction and debuff resistance. So just outright reducing the effectiveness of any attacks incoming and just kind of becoming impenetrable. So again, two different but very, very effective tank builds. And then his third build is actually a fighter bruiser build where he can really lean into dealing damage to his opponents via bleeds and dealing additional damage to enemies that are bleeding. But because of his high natural defense, you can really lean into the offense stats for Cap and end up walking away with a pretty well-balanced bruiser fighter who's pretty dangerous. All right, next up, we're looking at Doctor Strange. And as far as Doctor Strange's primary stats, they're actually pretty well balanced. He does have a little bit more attack than defense and a little bit more defense than HP. But all in all, they're all pretty sturdy. He's just got pretty solid, well-balanced base stats. As for his highest outright natural stats, he leads the way in cooldown decrease. No surprise there. And then he does come in second place for stamina recovery and ultimate skill gauge recovery. So as you may have guessed from the cooldown decrease and the ultimate skill gauge recovery, he is very, very spell-based. So he's got three interesting different kind of builds you can lean into. The first is more of a control mage or a debuff support. He does have a lot of abilities that control the opponent and, basically put a bunch of different debuffs on them, hard CC them, a lot of tools for really locking down an opponent and making their lives very inconvenient. Alternatively, he has a spell slinger or a spam spellcaster build, where if you want to be putting out damage on Doctor Strange, you can really lean into cooldown decrease and just constantly be firing off spells nonstop. You can also lean into some of that ultimate skill gauge recovery and just constantly be firing his ultimate. And then his third build, I think right now is one of the least useful options in the game as it stands, but maybe a time will come when it's a bit more useful, which is that he actually makes for a very good debuff resistance tank. He has some good specializations in there where he's able to resist a lot of control effects, reduce the effective times, and or just outright resist them. So you can really lean into debuff resistance and kind of be immune to a lot of control effects, but that's not super useful right now if you can't actually take the hits themselves. All right, next up, we're going to look at Black Widow. As far as her primary stats, should come as no surprise. She leads the way in the entire game right now for attack. A ton of attack. And then some of the lower defense and HP values in the game, but it's because she is just all front-loaded damage, and really that's that. So highest natural stats, attack and critical damage, and then where she comes in second place, ultimate skill gauge recovery, accuracy rate, and critical rate. So she has a few different builds, of course. The first being a controlled brawler or a CC fighter. There actually is more of a melee widow, where she has a lot of different tools for scrapping. She's got some abilities that make her a little bit more durable to be able to sit there and throw down. And because she has such naturally high offense, if she can weather a little bit of a storm, she can output a ton of control and damage. So she works all right as a bruiser for sure. Another build is an assassin or a single target crit, where she can just do so much damage with some insane crits that with just a few spells, she can take out several characters, just their entire health bar with well-placed shots. So definitely a bit more bursty, but just an absolute ton of damage. And finally, she has more of a duelist or a 1v1 fighter build. She gets a lot of different perks in her specializations as far as fighting isolated enemies or using single target attacks or attacking single targets, but she is very well equipped to play both offensively and defensively. She has a lot of dodge tools and the ability to go into stealth and be untargetable for periods of time. So she's just really, really well equipped to outplay an individual. All right, next up, we will take a look at Captain Marvel. Her stat distribution, as one would expect, a very, very high attack, followed pretty closely by a very high natural defense, and finally a bit above average HP, but really more of a fighter style stat distribution for sure. As far as her outright highest natural stats, she leads the way in stamina recovery and defense pierce. And then she gets the silver medal for guard damage and guard damage decrease. But yeah, definitely just a good mix of offense and defense. She is there to throw down, and there's a few different ways that you can do that. So her first build really leans into a lot of her cosmic energy style spells, where she kind of functions as a ranged blaster. Definitely a bursty ranged blaster, but she has a lot of ranged abilities, both single target and AoE, that do a lot of damage from afar. And also build her as a mobility melee fighter. She has a lot of different specializations that either give her extra dodge or reduce her other cooldowns when you dodge, and she has a line of abilities that are gap closes that kind of move her all over the place, so you can play a very hyper mobile melee fighter. And then finally, you can play her just as an outright off tank or a balanced bruiser, in that you can just lean into a bunch of specializations that give her raw offense and raw defense, and just let her kind of slug it out and be carried by her high offense and defense values. And yeah, just be a bruiser. All right, next up, we're going to take a look at Storm. Of her primary stats, Storm has more attack than anything else. She's got moderate above average HP, and finally, she's got an all right defensive stat, but her attack is definitely out in front, and for good reason. All around, her highest natural stats, ultimate skill gauge recovery and debuff accuracy. And she gets the silver medal for raw attack, raw HP, and defense pierce. But Storm is one of the more one-dimensional characters, although I think that she's excellent at what she does, so I think that's fine. Essentially, she is AoE DPS, so she really functions like a mage. If you just want to create maximum carnage and devastation to many things around you, Storm is very good for that with all of her builds. She does have some specialization within the builds, which we'll cover, but really they're all just different versions of being an AoE DPS machine. So in particular, she can really lean into her ice and frost abilities and do a lot of slow and dodge reduction on the enemy. Really good for hypermobile targets, just kind of not letting them move. So she has more of an ice mage build. She has an attack reduction build, which is really good for super high level raid content. If certain bosses are hitting for just a ton of damage, you can really lean into the shock and electricity build for Storm. And then finally, she has essentially a wind or an air build where she can do a lot of hard CC, knockdowns, knockbacks, things of that nature. Really good for controlling a handful of individuals or even a large group of individuals while laying down a ton of AoE DPS. But at the end of the day, no matter what build you go, Storm is going to be doing just tons of damage to everything around her with some utility sprinkled in for good measure. And finally, we're going to take a look at Star-Lord. As far as his primary stats, he has an interesting distribution in that he has very high attack, followed by moderately high defense, and finally, pretty standard mid-range HP. As far as his highest natural stats, he has an interesting assortment. He gets a ton of critical damage decrease, more than any other character. He also gets a ton of debuff accuracy and guard damage. So just kind of a mix of stats there. And then he comes in second place, silver medal for HP recovery. So he's a bit all over the place, but at his core, Star-Lord is a support. So he has a few different ways that he can be played, leaning into which of the elements you want to lean into and which combos. But at the end of the day, he is, in my opinion, the best support character in this game. There are some other characters with some support abilities, but none quite as good as Star-Lord. So you can really lean into a lot of his fire abilities and go kind of a damage over time blaster, stacking a lot of burn stacks while providing buffs and debuffs. Obviously buffing your team and debuffing the enemies, but yeah, just putting out really good sustained damage while doing that. Alternatively, you can lean into doing a lot of debuffing, specifically attack reduction. You can go a lot of his shock abilities, and again, while providing a slew of different buffs for your team. Or you can lean a bit more into his ice options and do a lot of slowing and dodge reduction while also providing a lot of buffs to the team. But depending on which variation you go with, you're essentially picking which debuffs you would like to accompany the excellent suite of positive effects that Star-Lord is going to bring to any party. But all right, so there you have it. This video's gone on long enough, so I'm going to wrap up. Thank you guys very much for checking out this video, and shout out to Livepool for editing this video. Please be sure to like, subscribe, and buy a waffle iron, and I will see you guys real soon. Until next time, peace!